the Friday lecture this month is Marina Kirsch. Marina Kirsch spent over 4 years researching and writing the story of her family from the Axis side of the World War II in Latvia, occupied Poland, and Germany. Her book, Flight of Remembrance, was an award-winning finalist in the narrative nonfiction category of the 2012 USA Best Book Awards. Since then, she has spoken at more than 100 venues in 10 states. Marina's presentations provide an opportunity to gain a new perspective on World War II, to recognize the universal importance of establishing meaning and goals in life, and to help preserve lessons and memories from the war and the Holocaust for posterity. Marina lives in Pennington, New Hampshire. She's a graphic designer, a book designer, an editor, a New Hampshire humanities speaker, and a member and officer of Toastmasters International, a worldwide organization that helps members gain public speaking and leadership skills. She is delighted to be able to speak here today. Please join me in welcoming Marina Kirsch.
Thank you, Danny. Is there value in stories from both sides of a world conflict, or only from the side of the victors? And the answer you give yourself, does that change if you know that the vanquished country was directly or indirectly responsible for the deaths of 50 to 70 million people worldwide? Now, I had to do a little bit of math to figure out how many people that really is. If you buried 5 people a day, it would take you over 27,000 years to bury 50 million, and over 38,000 years to bury 70 million. So many people, including millions of Holocaust victims, who never survived to live out their dreams and their life's purpose. World War II was a cataclysm without precedent, and Germany was the main aggressor. But the story that you'll hear this afternoon is one that you might not hear very often, because it's from the Axis side of the war, and it includes 2 German veterans, my father and my grandfather. The 2 main protagonists, as based on my book, are my parents, Ralph Dutzmann, a Latvian aeronautical engineering student, and Lila Wasul, the young woman that he met in 1940 Berlin. In 2004, before I started writing my book, someone came out with a comment. He said, "But it's a story about Nazis." I think the US impression is that most people in Germany did join the Nazi Party and did support Hitler, but there actually were many people who didn't. No one on either side of my family joined the Nazi Party, and no one supported Hitler. On one side, they were rather apolitical, and on the other side, they just didn't want much part of Hitler. So I had to consider, though. I'm glad that person came up with that comment early in the process. I hadn't even started writing my book. I was contemplating a movie treatment at that time, and I worked on that. But it made me ponder whether a story about German people during World War II should ever even be told. But I came to the conclusion that a story that gives a face, a name, and humanity to the enemy is far better than denying or burying the past. And it might actually be therapeutic and healing for some people. So what can you gain from this story from the other side? I can actually think of 4 things. First of all, you will hear how love and dreams supported by faith in God helped a family to find meaning in their lives and to fight despair, because despair was rampant everywhere in Europe during World War II, no matter which side you were on. It is our hopes for the future that really are the guiding light that point us in the direction of our destiny. The second thing is you will hear a little bit about what it was like to live through war waged on home soil, something that Americans only experienced during the Civil War. When I spoke in Virginia a few years ago, right near one of the big battlefields, I asked, how many of you were here in the Civil War? No one raised their hand. However, some of them did have relatives who served during the Civil War on the Confederate side, and they have some family stories that they have accumulated. But by and large, this is not an experience that people in the US have experienced. The other thing I might add is in Europe, after World War II, everyone was a loser. Every country was a loser. So was Ukraine and Russia. They had suffered so much. Infrastructure was destroyed. And really, there could be no winners under those circumstances. You will also hear a little bit today about the warning signs of genocide, something that I added to my program only about a year ago because I felt it's necessary all the time. But I feel, especially now, there are conditions developing around the world that lead me to have concerns. And the final thing is, you will help preserve memories of World War II and the Holocaust for posterity. And I feel this is an important process. In addition, if any of you, and I will be asking shortly, if any of you had relatives or were personally present in a country where the war was fought while it was being fought, I'm going to want to know that. And you might even be able to recover a little bit of your family's history if it has been lost. A number of people have emailed me after reading my book, thank you for giving me some idea of what my family went through when they fled Latvia during the war, because that is the story on my father's side. I'd like to find out now, because I was being hooked up, thank you, first of all, to the Chelmsford Public Library and Danny Lycansian. I appreciate that you invited me here, and I appreciate that all of you are here to attend and listen. So now I'd like to find out what stories we have in this room. First of all, I always ask, are there any World War II veterans present? From either side of the war? No. You all look too young, so I didn't actually expect that. How many of you had relatives, brothers, sisters, aunts, uncles, cousins, who served in World War II on either side? Keep your hand up if they served on the Axis side of the war. The Axis, that's right.
Both sides.
You had relatives serving on both sides. And where was the person on the Axis side of the war serving?
We don't know, just someplace in Germany.
Someplace in Germany, but they were on the side of Germany. Yes, okay. All right, so now I'd like to ask, how many veterans do we have present? Any war, wartime, peacetime, anytime, any branch of the service? Okay, and you're all, I assume, US veterans?
Czechoslovakia.
Czechoslovakia.
1960. You know.
Oh, yes,
So
well,
it was different.
Oh,
We stood against each other.
no kidding.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for offering that. So I never know what I'm going to encounter in these presentations, and I always learn something. Please come and talk to me later, and we will have some more time for discussion at the end. So next, were any of you present during World War II in a country that suffered war waged on home soil? Now that would include, you were alive already. How old were you when the war started?
I was born in 42.
In 42.
And I remember, German troops leaving in April, May 45. And I remember specifically a couple of bombing raids of the 8th Air Army on my hometown.
Now, do you actually remember that?
I remember, and I remember being out in the fields, and when a couple of P-51s were flying over, and they needed to unload a couple of bombs, and so the babysitter was pushing the carriage with my twin brother and sister threw us into a ditch.
Wow.
And I remember following morning going there with other citizens and seeing the craters that those bombs left. And
Well, that would be the kind of memory that you would never forget, and that you would remember at such a young age. You were what, maybe 3 years old at most?
2 or 3.
2 or 3.
Yes. And 2 and 3, yes, that was.
Yes, thank you so much for offering that.
Like to add, my cousin was a B-51 pilot in World War II. He was shot down over Germany, not France. So I'm pretty sure it wasn't my cousin shooting.
All right, so this man had a cousin who was shot down over France. He was in a B-51 bomber.
And a brother-in-law killed in Anzio.
Your father-in-law was killed, brother-in-law was killed at Anzio. And I know that we had a story, was it here or here, about a brother who served in World War, served in World War II.
Battle of the Bulge.
Battle of the Bulge, one of the worst battles of the entire war.
Didn't talk about it.
Yeah, so he survived, but he did not talk about it. This was the case for a lot of people, no matter what side they served on, also for Holocaust victims, for anyone who suffered through that terrible, terrible experience. There will be more time later. I'd love to hear from more. Does anyone else have a really unusual story from World War II, from a relative?
My father got into the Army Air Corps underage. His father had to sign for him to get in. However, he was married to my mother, who was expecting me when he was sent overseas. And he flew over the Posterity oil raids in Romania and was shot down and became a prisoner of war. And when he came home, he honestly didn't know if he had a son or a daughter.
Oh,
That would be me.
all right. So he was shot down over Romania. He was taken prisoner of war by Germany?
Yeah,
by Germany?
By the Romanians.
Oh, by the Romanians,
Yeah,
okay.
and he was liberated, really, by the Russians and sent to the Isle of Capri for R&R. So that's on my bucket list. I've already been in the B-24. Now I want to go to...
Time to go to Capri.
Yes, time to go to Capri.
Great place for a vacation, I understand. All right, so Danny, we could now lower the lights because I will now launch into my family story.
Somebody else has something to say.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, Rose.
My husband was born in Germany and lived through the war and up in the northern part and had to flee to the south with the Russians 2 miles from them. And she had to flee with 6 children. And you weren't allowed to travel on the roads because it was safe for the military, but they were able to get to a part in Germany where they would be safe.
So I was distracted a little bit by the remote and getting it turned on, but it was, who was it?
It was my husband and his family.
Husband's family. His mother had to flee with 6 children from
Northern part of Germany, where the Russians were 20 miles from
the northern part of Germany. Yes, and you'll hear too how in my family the people had to flee the Soviet troops also. That was a commonplace occurrence for a lot of people during the war. Starting with the cover of my book, in the helmet, my father, Rolf Dutzmann. By this time, it's 1942, and he has been drafted into the Luftwaffe, which is the German Air Force. But my father was a Latvian engineering student, aeronautical engineering student, who was forced to flee Latvia before the first Soviet takeover. On his helmet, I kept the eagle and swastika. I had to think a lot about that, but I decided because it was there in the actual photograph, and it's the only element on my book cover that identifies this as definitely being a story from the Axis side of the war. I felt I needed to keep it. If I were to publish in Germany, that would have to come off, as I found out. My parents, Rolf and Lilo, wedding day, November 1944. My older brother, Ingo, at age 2, born in post-war Bavaria. And above the title, Flying In, it's an illustration that I did of a pre-World War II Latvian glider from a photograph where my father was flying it in Latvia. And that little icon represents 2 things to me. First of all, my father Rolf's overarching goal in life to pursue a career in aeronautical engineering. But secondly, also, my own quest to gain a higher and wider understanding of World War II during the researching, writing, and now the presenting of my book. And I want to thank folks like you because I always gain some more information, another piece of that huge puzzle that was the cataclysm of World War II. Behind the people is rubble. That is a ruined family home in Berlin. And here, the award icon from the 2012 USA Best Book Awards in the narrative nonfiction category. I was really surprised and delighted to receive that award because I designed the book myself, the cover and the interior. I did have professional editors, though, throughout the process, in addition to my parents, who were both alive and could fill in a lot of blanks for me as I was writing. Has anyone read this book, Man's Search for Meaning, by Viktor Frankl? Okay, a couple or a few of you have. Was that an amazing book?
Yes.
All right. I have a mailing list here that I will pass around. If you put your email address on it, I will send you my World War II suggested reading list that includes books by Viktor Frankl. Let's start here. I do not share email addresses, by the way, with anyone, and the only time you would get emails would be if I have events coming up. Frankl was a Viennese Jew who suffered through the concentration camp system during World War II. He survived, and after the war, he founded the third Viennese school of psychotherapy known as logotherapy. Logotherapy helps people to find meaning in their lives. Frankl found meaning even at Auschwitz. And for my family, my parents, my grandparents, even though they didn't know Frankl and they never read his books, but it was hope and finding meaning and hope for the future, and also their faith in God, that helped them to find or visualize a future beyond the cataclysm. Because a lot of people, they never could even look beyond that. But my family members, key family members, did. I believe this helped them to survive. Survival is very much fueled if we have a vision for our future that we're working toward. Let's go back now to 1924 Latvia. The little boy, age 5, is my father, Rolf, with his mother, Maria, his little sister, Ruth, and his father, Ernst. Now, Ernst, my grandfather, also had a vision. He had a dream, and his dream and vision was always the same. From a young age, living in Latvia and sitting on a hillside of his family's farm and daydreaming, his dream was to be captain of a ship bound for America. However, that was not something that would be possible during World War II. He had tried after World War I, but couldn't find sponsors. But during World War II, it also was not possible. My father, Rolf, is at the left in this photo. He's been building model gliders already for years to fuel his passion for airplanes. So many young people at that point in time, young men, but also some young women, had dreams about a career in aeronautical engineering. Let's not forget, aeronautics was very young still at that time, and it was a worldwide obsession. By age 18, my father has gone as far as he can go with model gliders. This was a Latvian national award-winning glider, and he is already building his first full-sized manned glider and a full-sized motorized plane. By that time also, by the way, I should add that my father, Rolf, actually already at the age of 13 or 14, he could read, speak, and understand the English language. And that was a skill that would save his life toward the end of the war. Now here you see a photograph of my father flying that glider. This is what I used to do the little icon of the glider on my cover. The photograph was not clear enough for me to use it as is. Rolf was with a group of young men called the Izargs. How many of you know about the Civil Air Patrol? A lot of young people here in the US are involved in that. This was kind of similar. And it was the closest thing that Latvia had to a national guard between the two world wars. But when the Soviets came, the Izargs were disbanded forever. Now here, Danny, could we have the lights back on? Here you might see something interesting. Yes?
How close to the terms of the Versailles Treaty was this flying club and those guys?
I don't think that, I'm not sure. I never actually thought about that. I mean, they were...
wasn't supposed to have any kind of military airplanes, and my understanding was they had these clubs, and when people said, hey, you can't do this, oh, it's just civilian guys having...
Yeah, but remember, that wasn't Germany.
No, but
That was
that's
Latvia.
their part. I don't know if the treaty applied to other countries. You know.
No, it would not have applied to Latvia. Latvia had a military. It had a military. I don't know that they had a lot of planes, but they had a navy, they had an army. My grandfather was in the army. So thank you for bringing that up, but this was Latvia, not Germany.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's good to know. Thank you.
So the dress I have on, you'll see my grandmother was wearing it in 1935. She handmade and embroidered it in the early 1930s. She was wearing it toward the end of that decade, middle and end. This was my Aunt Ruth's confirmation day, so special occasion. She's wearing it in 3 photographs in my book. Now, when I was a teenager, she altered it to fit me, and miraculously, it still fits. Now, I'm going to turn my back on you, something I don't normally do with audiences, but you really need to see the sleeves. The embroidery design I found out from a costume museum in Riga, Latvia, is an authentic Latvian pattern. I'm so glad my grandmother chose a Latvian design. And the jewelry I'm wearing is called a Curzon brooch. These were worn by women in the southwestern part of Latvia on the Baltic Sea, where the family lived. Women wore them as a sign of the family's wealth. So if they had more than one, I actually saw illustrations and photographs of women in Latvia wearing 4 or 5 of them, usually up here. I didn't want to hide the embroidery, so I'm wearing it down here instead. And I actually have 5 of these. I could have worn them all, but I decided I'm not wealthy enough, so one is good. But the museum in Latvia would like to have the brooch. They said, oh, sorry about the dress, we won't take it, because eventually I would like to donate it somewhere. They only take garments from before 1900. But I'm thinking, if I wear it for maybe another 20 years, might they change their minds? I'm hoping they might. There are many treasures that our family managed to save from the World War I and the World War II time period. Photographs, 132 of them are included in my book, but we have many more. Documents, letters, even a set of china that my grandfather gave to my grandmother, Rosenthal china from Germany in the 1930s, completely preserved. Not a single chip or a crack. Every piece is present, and I sometimes use it at my home now when I'm entertaining. We have other memorabilia, but the most important thing was a family history that my parents, Rolf and Lilo, wrote in the early 1990s and then passed on to their children and grandchildren. That was the greatest treasure. Once I had that book in my hands and I had the entire story, I knew I would eventually do something with it. Preservation is a gift to future generations. So everybody here, think about what there is about your personal life or your family's life that should be preserved and shared. It's a treasure for future generations. We could turn the lights back down. Would anyone like to shout out which country was most dreaded by people of German heritage across Europe at the time of World War II? Actually, already World War I. Russia, yes. And actually, it was the Soviet Union, USSR, but no one called it that. Everyone called it Russia. In Germany it was Russland, and it even sounds ominous. Russland. In the fall of 1939, my father, Rolf, had just begun his aeronautical engineering education at the University of Riga. But then, an ominous phone call came from my grandfather Ernst, his father, urging him to come home immediately. Rolf knew something was up. He could tell by his father's voice, but his father refused to tell him over the phone. So he went home. Come to find out that my grandfather Ernst had gotten wind of the fact that a Soviet takeover was imminent, and not just Latvia, but all three of the Baltic states and probably part of Poland would be taken over. And for people of German descent or German heritage, who, by the way, were all over the face of Europe at this point in time, and had been for a long time. They had been in Latvia since the 1200s. But for people of German heritage, being under a Soviet occupation was a dangerous thing. They were more likely to be executed or deported if they were German. And for my grandfather, especially, he was at greater risk than most. Here he is in Tsarist Russian uniform. He was in the Tsarist Russian army during World War I, where he served as an officer and was taken prisoner of war by Germany, ironically. I could have made this book about my grandfather mainly, but he was no longer alive. I couldn't ask questions, and the love story wasn't quite there. But my grandfather's life is one of turmoil and chaos and incredible survival. So, Tsarist Russian officer, World War I, that's strike one against him. Strike two, he was a Latvian officer in between the two world wars for the Latvian army. And strike three, he was an ardent anti-communist, and everyone around him knew it. Now, for the Dutzmann family in 1939, something that a lot of people don't think about, and actually, I didn't think about it too much until I was writing my book. They had not yet formed a verdict on Hitler and the Nazi regime. Perhaps a lot of people around the world had not yet at this point in time, but they certainly hadn't. They only knew that the enemy of their enemy must be their friend, or at least it would be the only country under which they could survive. So at this point in time, in the Eastern European countries especially, you had to choose sides. You could not be neutral, and neither side really was your friend per se. They were two brutal regimes, and you were caught in the middle. You had to determine where your best chances for survival lay. I have to admire my grandfather, that he had the foresight and the insight to realize that the family would not fare well if they remained in Latvia, and to do what needed to be done to flee while they could. They could have given in to all this, but instead it was their love for each other and their hopes for the future that kept them looking forward, looking for that path into the future that would mean survival for them. And so it was that they fled Latvia when the going was still good. And that was in late 1939. Here, my father Rolf with his mother Maria and sister Ruth, not too long before they, along with Ernst and 50,000 other Latvians of German heritage, fled Latvia for Germany. And Germany, by the way, was the only place that would accept refugees from other parts of Europe if they had German heritage. You couldn't go anywhere else. So to save your life, you would go to Germany. And their sense of foreboding was ominously accurate, by the way. After the Soviet takeover, Latvian officers who failed to flee were shot on the spot, and tens of thousands of Latvian citizens were either executed or deported. But that tragedy played out over and over and over again. The Eastern European countries in particular suffered. This photograph was taken after the Germans moved in. So first tragedy, the Soviet takeover, 1940. The second tragedy, the German takeover of 1942, which started the Holocaust in Latvia, where 75,000 Latvian Jews were heartlessly murdered. This photograph is from German military archives. I mean, my family had left quite a while before this. And then, of course, after the German takeover, another brutal takeover by the Soviets in 1945. With each wave of takeover, more deportations and executions. And this happened not only in Latvia, but in Lithuania, in Estonia, in Poland. Perhaps those were the countries that were affected most drastically at the beginning of the war. A map of 1939 Europe, December. In the tan, Germany proper, including East Prussia off to the right, which was considered part of Germany. In the darker tan, countries that Germany had already annexed or taken over, including the former Austria, and here, half of the former Poland. Then in red, the other half of Poland, partly off the map, taken over by the Soviet Union. Does anyone know the name of the pact? Where Germany, it's a secret pact between Germany and Soviet Union, where they agreed to carve up Poland between them, and no one knew it was going to happen.
Stalin Molotov.
Yeah, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, or also known Stalin, there was another name for it, I know. Yes, thank you. So that was a secret.
What was the name of it?
Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was one. I think it was a non-aggression treaty. Does that ring a bell to anyone? Usually I refer to it as Molotov-Ribbentrop, and they were the two government officials who actually negotiated the pact. In the south, two countries, Switzerland and Slovakia, that also play a part in the family story. And then further north, in green, the Baltic states of Latvia, actually Lithuania in the south, then Latvia and Estonia. And these countries were like a string of jewels on the Baltic Sea. They were fought over by Germany and the Soviet Union for a long, long time, and also even Russia before Soviet Union. They were very desirable. My father's family lived on the Baltic Sea, north of a city called Liepaja, in a military enclave called Kara Osta. Now, at Kara Osta, my grandfather was head of a department in a munitions laboratory, and he was a Latvian army officer at the time. When the family fled, it was from this dotted line trajectory down to an island in the Baltic Sea called Uzedom. And when their ship left the port city of Riga, they and the 2,000 other people on board became people without a home, people without a national identity, and people who had no idea what their fate would be under the Nazi regime. For the men, there was a danger of being immediately drafted upon arrival. That was perhaps their worst fear. However, their second worst fear came to pass relatively quickly when they were sent to occupied Poland, first to the city of Posen. Here is Rolf writing in his journal en route to Posen by train. He is apprehensive whether the Nazi regime will draft him immediately or whether they will allow him to continue the education that he had just so recently started in Latvia.
Did Rolf know how to speak German?
Did he know how to speak German? Yes. Yes, everyone in the family spoke German. The reason for that is my grandmother was a German woman. It gets complicated because when my grandfather was taken prisoner of war after World War I, it was as a German prisoner of war. And he, because of his skills, he was very technically skilled. Germany loved to keep him after the war. So he worked there after the war, met my German grandmother, they married. My father was actually born in Germany, but by the time he was 2, with my grandfather homesick for Latvia, they moved back to Latvia. But yes, the entire family could speak Latvian, German, and some of them spoke Russian as well. And my father, of course, in his early teens was already able to speak English. So yes, they all spoke German as well as Latvian. And my grandmother was apprehensive too, what the family's fate would be in occupied Poland. It was the most dangerous part, most dangerous place in all of Europe at the time. Their fate in Posen, they were housed in a crude, unheated barracks. They slept on straw on the floor, and the food was equally dismal. But what happened next was even worse. They didn't stay there long. Next, they were sent to Litzmannstadt or Lodz, even farther east, and far, far too close to the Soviet threat for the comfort of the family, especially my grandfather. Now in Litzmannstadt, my grandfather was supposed to find work, but he couldn't find any work there commensurate with his skills. Next, the regime sent the family to Berlin, and it was there that my grandfather got his first employment. And as soon as the regime realized his skills, they decided to draft him. They drafted him as a major into the German army, and he was sent back to that island of Usedom, where he trained under Werner von Braun for V-2 rocket inspection. How many of you have heard of Werner von Braun? All right, well, he's the rocket genius, right, who was brought to the US. And how many of you have heard of Peenemünde? Peenemünde was the top secret classified development center where the V1 and V2 rockets were developed. And you might say it was the birthplace of modern rocketry. That installation, though, was bombed in August of 1943, not to the point where they could no longer use it for development purposes. However, they realized that mass production of the V1 and V2 would have to be moved elsewhere. They decided on a location in the heart of Germany, there, near a town called Nordhausen. I visited this area. It's in the Harz Mountain region, and this facility was called Mittelwerk. It was an underground classified installation, a vast network of tunnels. And it was there that my grandfather was forced to work the last 14 months of the war until he was taken prisoner of war. That little dot that just flew in, that is Danzig or Gdansk, which is in occupied Poland, or was at the time. I will be talking about that in a little bit. I just wanted you to see it. It is surrounded by Nazi-occupied Poland, and it's on that little narrow corridor that gave Poland at that time some access to the Baltic Sea. Let's go now to my mother's side of the family. My mother, Lieselotte was her full name, is a little girl at age 2 with her parents, Gertrude and Walter Wassol. She was born and raised in Berlin. She grew up pretty much with Hitler coming to power. She was a very young teenager when he came to power. And when the war began, she was 19 years old. She saw and experienced a lot more of what the Nazi regime was bringing to pass in Germany than my father's family did as latecomers. She saw at first that some things seemed to improve. For example, the infrastructure in Germany was improving, people were being put back to work, but she soon also saw the sinister underpinnings of the Nazi regime. Here she is as a young teenager. Actually, at this point, she's only about 10 years old. Not too long after this, she refused to join the League of German Girls. Now, in her family, same as in Rolf's, no one joined the Nazi Party, and no one supported Hitler. And Lilo didn't want anything to do with this group. They were the same as Hitler Youth for Boys. She considered them sinister, atheistic, and wanted nothing to do with them. Lilo also had a dream. So there were 3 people at least, maybe more, who had these major dreams and hopes for the future. For my mother, it was for a loving, harmonious, and supportive home life and marriage which didn't exist for her parents in her growing up years. Her parents had a very rocky marriage, and it ended in divorce when Lila was only 13. At this point, she is 19. She is about to meet my father at a dance at the Olympic Stadium Cafe, and then her dream would begin to get underway. But there were interruptions to that dream and setbacks along the way. The city of Danzig or Gdansk, in that little corridor of occupied Poland that I showed you, once the family, Rolf's family, arrived in Berlin, he received the welcome news that he would be allowed to finish his education, and it was supposed to be at the Technical University of Gdansk. So Rolf traveled there to begin, or I should say to resume, his education. Now, Gdansk was a free city of Europe at one time, but no longer. By this time, fully under Nazi domination, as you can see. This was actually an image from Getty Images that I took online. In 1941, though, December, his dream came crashing down. The same day that he received his diploma, he also received his draft notice into the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force. And unlike my grandfather, who had kind of made a career in the military because of his technical skills, think about it. The big corporations that exist now, they didn't exist back then. If you wanted to really advance your skills, the military was the place. But Rolf didn't want that. He didn't want to be in the military at all. For him, this was a disaster. He had hoped that the war would be long over before he graduated. Now, in the news at that time were two words. It was the place where no German military personnel wanted to be sent at that time. Does anyone have an inkling what those two words, which front did they? Yeah, the Russian front or the Eastern front. In German, it was the Ostfront. It could be that Rolf was reading a story from the Eastern Front in this newspaper in Berlin. And the stories that were filtering back from the Eastern Front were horrifying beyond belief. Rolf, though, was fortunate. He was fortunate because of his technical skills that he was kept working in a technical capacity as an airplane design instructor, as also in flying gliders. He received glider certifications during the war. And then later on, he signed up for navigator training, thinking that, yes, probably another year or maybe a year and a half would be taken up with the training. He was only sent to the front very late in the war. And the way that he was occupied during the war also supported his vision for the future in an aeronautical engineering capacity. He never was forced to fly any bombing or combat missions against the Allies, I'm happy to report. 1.4 million tons of bombs fell on Germany during the war. 363 air raids against Berlin alone. But there were two other cities in Germany that suffered even worse bombing in terms of the intensity of the bombing and the resulting firestorms. Would anyone like to yell out which cities those were? Dresden. Hamburg. Yes, yes. You folks are sharp. Dresden and Hamburg. You know, hardly a month goes by where I don't read about at least one story. Google sends me any important stories that deal with World War II every week. And there often are stories about portions of German cities needing to be evacuated because they found another bomb somewhere, in a basement, under a street, somewhere where they're excavating, or even out in a farmer's field somewhere. They will never find all of the bombs in Germany, according to experts that I've read reporting on this. This shows the family home in Berlin on my father's side after an Allied bombing in March of 1944. The outside and the interior. We have these photographs only because my father, Rolf, took bombing leave in order to go home and inspect the damage. Now, bombing leave and wedding leave were the only kinds of leave still available to German soldiers at this late stage in the war. My mother's home was also destroyed, but one floor at a time, until finally the top 2 floors blown away, walls and ceilings badly damaged, windows shattered, pipes burst, and water pouring into the apartment. She and my grandmother Gertrude could no longer live there. They finally moved themselves, in an attempt to save their lives, they moved themselves at night to a storage space they had rented outside the city for their treasured possessions, which included things like family documents, letters, all those things that I still have in our family collection today. The word from the regime was, no working person leaves Berlin, and that was the law. But finally, my mother found a job in a small town northwest of Berlin. They kept trying, and love and dreams. They were allowed to leave the beleaguered city of Berlin and move to that little town, which never got bombed during the war. So perhaps that saved their lives. But on a bit of a poignant note, all of my mother's relatives, including her father, with the exception of her mother, they stayed together. But all of her relatives, including her father, were trapped in the eastern part of Germany, which came under Soviet domination, and she never saw any of them again. That is one of the sad effects of war fought on home soil. And by the way, that happened not only in Germany, it happened all across Europe. People had to flee their homes. Some people never saw their loved ones or relatives again, and some of them never even knew what happened to them. This is the only known photograph of my grandfather in the underground installation of Mittelwerk, where the V-1 and V-2 rockets were mass produced. This is where he worked as chief inspector of the V-2 from February of 1944 until April of 1945, when all of the personnel were told to evacuate. I knew nothing about his role during the war. My father knew nothing other than his title. This photograph was only unearthed after my grandfather's death among his personal effects, and he never talked about it. That is, I shouldn't say he never talked about it, but he didn't tell us much, and we didn't know what to ask. I had to do a lot of research, therefore, on my grandfather's role, which I did, online sources, but also books and post-war transcripts. I was really dreading what I might find out, especially when I realized that there was a much dreaded slave labor camp right outside the gates of this installation. It was notorious all across Europe. It was one of the places where inmates did not want to be sent, and tens of thousands died there during the last 3 years of the war. I dreaded what else I might find. However, by this time I was on a quest. At a point when I thought I was done with my book was when I really started the hard research. And I'm glad that I found out about this, because otherwise, might I have been accused of whitewashing my family's story? My grandfather worked at this place. So I searched further. And from the director of a concentration camp memorial that now stands at the gates of the Mittelbau-Dora camp, I received post-war transcripts from one of the inmates. And I also started reading books. There were a couple of inmates who wrote books about their experience in that camp. I was relieved to find out that my grandfather became very friendly with one inmate in particular. He had 200 Army and civilian engineers working under him and only 3 inmates. One of them was a Czech by the name of Yuri Benish. And come to find out, Yuri Benish not only wrote a book in the post-war time about his experiences at that camp, but he also provided post-war transcripts in German, which I was able to read. And he notes that my grandfather saved his life on more than one occasion when he was supposed to be interrogated by the SS. It was the SS who set up this camp. It was set up already before my grandfather's arrival, and they were the ones who terrorized the underground tunnel network during the war when this plant was in operation. But my grandfather saved him from interrogation. He claimed that Mr. Benish was far too essential to the inspection process and would not let him go. And this was fortunate, because after the war, something my grandfather might not have known, Benish admitted in books and post-war transcripts that he was committing sabotage. They would have discovered that under the floorboards of his desk, he had stashed paperwork that he intended to smuggle out with him at the end of the war. That didn't happen, but Benish did survive. So I'm really happy that I encountered this information, and also that I found out that my grandfather helped the inmates in his department as best he could, but it was under very dire circumstances. I have 3 regrets about my grandfather's time in this place. First, that I didn't know the questions to ask him when he was still alive. Wish I had. Second, that he probably never knew that Yuri Benish survived the war. If he had found out, I'm sure it would have been through some kind of mail correspondence, and I'm sure he would have kept the letters, but there was nothing. And 3, I regret that my grandfather, because of the fact that he was forced to work in this place, will probably forever be associated with the perpetrators at Middlework, because there were only 2 kinds of people there. There were the victims, the inmates, and there were the perpetrators, who were the ones who were forced to work there. However, perhaps as his granddaughter, I can do something about that. Yes?
How many years ago did your father die? Grandfather died?
My grandfather died in the early 1980s, quite a long time ago. And I was still fairly young at the time, was long before my parents wrote the family history, long before I started researching and writing my book. Here's one of the tunnels in the underground installation as it looks today at the Middle-Baldura concentration camp memorial. I paid a trip there, a visit there in 2011, and my husband and I received a tour from the director at the time. And I also donated the prior photograph and some documents from my grandfather's time there. Today, it is a place of commemoration solely for the inmates who toiled and died there, and nothing at all to do with the superior rocket technology that was carried out there. My grandfather, by the way, knew that these secret weapons would not win the war. They were far too imprecise, and he was too knowledgeable about the difficulty of the manufacturing process. So in 1944, the Allies were at the east and the west borders of Germany, ready to encroach in November of 1944. But a love story was playing out that would span more than 2 continents and across 70 years. In November of 1944, my parents, Rolf and Leela, were married. It was really a dark time in the war, and they didn't know yet that the worst times for German citizens and military personnel alike were still ahead. Within 6 months of these photographs being taken, my father, Rolf, and my grandfather, Ernst, were both taken prisoner of war by the Americans. And my mother, Lilo, and my grandmother, Gertrude, were forced to flee the Soviet troops more than once. Perhaps worst of all, though, for almost a year, neither Rolf nor Lilo knew whether the other was still alive. They had no way to communicate. Toward the very end of the war, my father was for a brief time in Slovakia between assignments. So he's not in military uniform at this point. You can see he's taken a little hostage. He took a liking to this little kitten and left it with a farm family shortly after, because now the very worst thing that Rolf could ever imagine was taking place. He, along with tens of thousands of other military personnel, were sent to the front near the Rhine River. When they arrived there, however, with no weapons left to be given out, Germany had hardly any fuel, hardly any weapons. The Luftwaffe was hardly flying anymore by this time. And so with no weapons left to be given out and the war as good as over, he and his unit were told shortly after arrival that they should flee. They should desert. They should walk homeward. And so Rolf and his unit did. But here is where this kind of story differs from another one where military personnel serve overseas. When war is fought on home soil, not only military personnel, but also homes and families are at risk. So my father and the other men with him walked homeward, but not knowing if home was still even there, or whether their family was even still there, or were they even still alive, because they had no communication. My father, Rolf, walked 160 miles homeward in late winter, hoping that there was still a home to return to.
When you say homeward, do you mean like sort of Berlin?
Well, here's the thing. When there was still communication, they could keep up with where home was. The latest letter he received from his mother was when they were in a place called Bennikenstein, which was near the Mittelwerk plant in the Harz Mountain region. So that's where he walked to, hoping that home was still there. And fortunately, home was still there. So my grandmother and my aunt were there when my father arrived. I'm not telling you more, though. You have to read about it in the book. Because in between now, this photograph and the next one, I'm leaving out the most dramatic. Am I making that noise, Brian?
No.
No? In between this photograph and the next one, I'm leaving out the most dramatic, most cathartic part of the story for you to read about in the book. It is a truly amazing, synchronistic chain of events, largely orchestrated by my mother's mother, Gertrude, who is a major mover and shaker in this story, to bring my mother, Lilo, and my father, Rolf, back together. The way that that happened is almost too much to believe, but we have the piece of paper still in our possession, which my grandmother brought back from the East Zone, which said, Rolf lebt, Rolf lives. And my mother knew he was alive, but she just had to find him. So that story you'll have to read about in the book, because next I am jumping to post-war Bavaria. This photograph is one of my favorites of my parents of all time. They are smiling down at their post-war dream, my brother Ingo at age 2, and here at age 3. And lo and behold, he is the only German child documented to have grown a tail. How did that happen? It just so happens that the same grandmother that made the dress I have on had a sense of humor. She wanted to see the little fox child playing in the vegetable garden. And this is a very good time for me to interject a little bit about what it's been like to be the child of German people during World War II. So people who were in Germany. What did they and other people in Germany know about the Holocaust and about death camps? This question has plagued me for much of my life, and my brother too. I have a younger brother too, but he was born in the States. He hardly thinks about these things. But my older brother and I do. Do we have a question?
Well, I was just going to say, I served with a guy who commanded a tank across Germany in World War II, and he spoke German. So he was pressed into service, rounding up SS people after the war. And he was convinced that most of the German people did not know.
Did not know. Well, it's interesting. If you read stories about people during World War II, including some Jewish people who posed as non-Jews during the war and got away with it, survived, so they were in Germany. Some of them did not know that their entire family died until after the war was over. So you would think that they would have known. Here's the thing. Everyone in Germany knew that concentration camps existed. Everybody, probably without exception. It was talked about all the time, and it's where enemies of the regime were sent. But who were those enemies of the regime? They didn't necessarily know that their local pastor or a priest or ordinary dissenting citizens might be sent there. They also didn't necessarily know what happened in those camps. Where the distinction needs to be made is between people going to concentration camps because they're enemies of the regime, or maybe they are captured, you know, they're POWs or partisans or captured resistance fighters. Distinction between that and actual genocide. So there was plenty of genocide carried out in Germany proper too, but most of the genocide was carried out in occupied Poland where the camps were. So the regime, the Nazi regime, did not publicize this, and deliberately. Now, did people in the upper echelons of the military, the government, hospitals and institutions, the church even, and industries that supplied the camps know everything? Absolutely. They were the people who did. A lot of other people didn't, because the regime put out a lot of propaganda. It was very hard to substantiate some of the claims that were made. You didn't know what was propaganda and what isn't. You risk your life if you listen to Radio Moscow, Voice of America, or any BBC. You risk your life to do that. And even then, would you know if what you were hearing was propaganda or not? Yes, we have a question here.
Now, how is that different from the gulags that under Stalin?
Well, that was terrible too, but different country, and I'm not as knowledgeable about that, I'm afraid. But I think the estimates are that even more people died under the Stalin regime than under the Nazi regime. I mean, when you're getting into those kind of millions of people, though, all of it is terrible. But it just drives home the fact that folks were trapped between these two brutal regimes. And if you were in the Eastern European countries, you kind of had to know which one might save you. And just as an interesting anecdote, by the way, so when the German troops came up the coast and they first went into Lithuania, the Holocaust started there. Then next, Latvia, 75,000 Jews murdered there. By the time they got to Estonia, some of the word was out. And as soon as the Germans came in, 9,000 Estonian Jews fled with the Soviet troops, and many of them survived in Russia. You had to know where your salvation lay. And for those Estonian Jews, it was with Russia. For Baltic Germans, it was Germany. At least you had a chance that way. So getting back to this, all right, the Nazi regime did not publicize. For the most part, Allied sources also didn't publicize during the war. It was after the war when they mostly did. My parents were horrified when they read the reports and saw the photographs from the camps in the post-war time, in newspapers primarily. My question is, did my grandfather know? I suspect he did. He was a major in the German army. But the other thing about the German army, how many of you know that by and large the German army and many of its officers were opposed to Hitler? And many of them never joined the Nazi Party. Many of them didn't support Hitler. And one of them actually plotted to kill Hitler. Yep. How many of you saw the movie some years back with Tom Cruise? Yes, I mean, it's a dramatic story. Von Stauffenberg was the name of the officer, and he was killed for that attempt.
My understanding is there were about 33 different attempts to kill Hitler.
Yes, and amazingly, they all failed. Truly incredible.
It's pure luck, no bad luck.
Yes, but I suspect my grandfather may have known. However, here's the thing. So he worked at 2 installations where there were camps. At Peenemünde, there was also a small camp, about 3,000 inmates there. But at the camp at Mittelwerk, there were, I don't know, 18, 20,000. The thing is, they were captured resistance fighters and partisans, by and large, from the countries with which Germany was waging war. They were not, by and large, people from persecuted groups, like Jews, gypsies, gay people, the terminally ill. Those people were not there. So did my grandfather know? I suspect he did. But of course, what could he do? He could only help the inmates in his department. About a year ago, I decided I wanted to add something a little more substantial to my presentation. So here are a few facts about genocide from a course that I took on genocide studies with a professor from Keene State College. First, it's ordinary people who perpetrate genocide, even though they may be led by a dictator like Hitler. But by and large, it's ordinary people whose fears become magnified who carry out genocide. 20 to 30 countries, according to genocidewatch.org, are currently at risk of genocide or they are already experiencing it. Warning signs of genocide: political instability, exclusionary ideology, including singling out scapegoats, one or more, and finally, a national policy of isolationism. I see the latter two developing around the world. Do you?
Yeah.
I see it developing here in the US.
Isolationism getting closer to nationalism.
They kind of go hand in hand sometimes. They don't have to, but I think they often do. If it's a feeling that nationalism is, I only care about my country and engage with everyone else, then that is definitely a dangerous policy. So the progression toward genocide includes about 10 steps that were pointed out in the class, but including discrimination, dehumanization, polarization, persecution. The next step after that is full-fledged genocide. Does anyone know what is the key factor for prevention of genocide in the world today? Some of these things, by the way, really took me by surprise. This one took everyone in the class by surprise. And no one in any of my talks has ever guessed it.
Freedom press.
I'm sorry?
Journalism.
Well, that could help or it could hinder. It depends.
When you say perpetrate, what do you mean by perpetrating genocide?
Actually killing people.
Oh, so they're the ones
Like working in a camp and killing them, or like one instance in Africa, the genocide in Africa, I think it was Rwanda, where some members of a Catholic church, men, would take children that they had taught in Sunday school and bash their heads against the wall of the church to kill them because they felt that those children were part of a dangerous group that they had to exterminate. Perfect example. So those people will actually go to the point of either supporting the full-fledged genocide and knowing fully about it, or actually carrying out the murdering. Key factor today? US involvement. Does that amaze you? We have a great responsibility in the world, everybody. Without US involvement, it's unlikely other countries will become involved and take the steps that are necessary to deter tragedy. Democracy and freedom are not free, and they are not self-perpetuating. It takes vigilant, informed, and socially active citizens to maintain those individual and national freedoms that we enjoy. And that is around the world.
The U.S. shouldn't take on 100% of that responsibility. In my opinion, it should be done.
Well, we have to get it started. Okay, the point is we have to get the ball rolling, because without US involvement, the other countries are unlikely to even get going. That's the problem. And with any worldwide effort, I feel that that is true. Whether it's that, or whether it's climate change, or whether it's anything else, US needs to at least be involved in the process.
German soldier comes to him speaking in broken Czech and saying, "You, Herr Apotheker, think that these people liberating you from the East are the winners?
Huh.
You are mistaken. They are worse than those Nazis." And indeed, that was the case that followed.
Yes, you know, my father recounted how toward the end of the war, carts and horse-drawn carriages and whatever came from the east with German soldiers. Some of them brought Russian women with them. I mean, they They were coming from all of those eastern countries.
I said, you think that these, the winners, okay, are defeaters, that
Yeah.
but it will bring you freedom?
There were no winners. In Europe, there were no winners of World War II, really. They all suffered. And even Great Britain suffered long after the end of World War II. Let's hold other questions, by the way, for the end. We will have time for questions and further discussion at that point. But I do want to say, when did you come over to the US?
Well, I came to Canada in 68.
Canada in 68.
Soviets invaded my country, again.
Okay. And then when did you come to the US?
In 86, 85, 86.
85?
Yeah, 85.
Okay. Oh, I'm glad you're here. In late 1951, on a cold, foggy day, my father, Rolf, with my mother, Lilo, 8 months pregnant, and my older brother, Ingo, took their leave of Germany. Here they are outside the little house they lived in Bavaria, which was built by my grandfather, by the way, from shipping crates. There was no housing in Germany. And they traveled across a rubble-strewn countryside, arriving in Switzerland only to find that their flight to America would be postponed until the following morning because all of Northern Europe was covered in fog. But the next morning, on the brink of my family's odyssey to the New World, I decided I wanted to be born in Switzerland. So I made my entry into the post-war Old World, and then my family had to come up with plane fare for me because even infants didn't fly for free, and they had no money. So they raised money. We had sponsors in the US, generous people in a tiny town in northern Indiana called Wakarusa. Now that is a Potawatomi Indian word for knee-deep in mud. But these people were generous beyond belief. So they sent money. The pastor of the Church of the Brethren in Wakarusa sent money. Some relatives who had preceded us to New York City sent some money, and my grandparents in Bavaria scraped up what they could. So finally, we did fly. And here, my brothers and I have a younger brother who was born in Indiana. We are in the backyard of the first house that my father rented after he got his first job in the US. We are eternally indebted to the people of Wakarusa. I dedicated my book to the people of Wakarusa in addition to my parents, and as soon as it was published, I made plans. I donated a book to the library in Wakarusa and made plans to travel there for one of my very first presentations, and I've been back there 2 more times since. We also have reforged connections with people in Wakarusa, including the granddaughter of our sponsors. My parents kept in touch with those folks for their entire lives until they all passed away. And now only the descendants of our sponsors are still around. But we're back in touch with 3 or 4 of them at this point. My grandfather, remember he had that dream to be captain of a ship bound for America? Well, his dream came to pass in February of 1952 when he and my grandmother Maria boarded a ship bound for America. No, he wasn't the captain of the ship. But the more I think about it, his skills no longer tied to the regime of any country of the world. He now was the captain of his own destiny. And I feel that that may have been one of the most liberating things for my grandfather. It's also one of the few photographs of him out of uniform. In 1958, we became naturalized citizens, all except for my younger brother at lower left. And it was shortly after this photograph was taken that both my father, Rolf, who is at center back, and my grandfather, Ernst, were hired by Chrysler Missile and Space Division near Detroit, where my father, Rolf, became head of a team of engineers that designed and built components of the Saturn 1B rocket. Those were later used successfully in all of the Apollo moon missions. So to me, the amazing thing is, it's another illustration of that principle, that when you have hope and a dream that you're aiming for, somehow, not only it does help your survival, you may not survive, but then again, your chances are better, but also those will come to pass the more you visualize and dream of them. But my father's dream was not only disrupted and destroyed by war and chaos, but it actually expanded to a key role in the US space program. At back right, my grandmother Gertrude, my mother's mother, major mover and shaker in this story. You have to read it to believe it. Now, after retirement, my father had a new dream and a new goal, and it was to share his enthusiasm and his skills in engineering with young people and adults all across the Granite State, because my parents had retired to New Hampshire by then. Here he is with a group of young astronauts at the Alton School. At one of my presentations in Laconia, New Hampshire, one man said, "That's my son." The little boy right in the front with his back to the camera. And here he is with Kensington Summer Camp in 2011. They have built model rockets and they're about to launch them. My parents' story, here they are, my mother's 90th birthday in 2011. My parents' story is as much about cherishing a dream and looking toward a goal in life, and also all of it supported by their faith. That is as important as the story of survival that is featured in my book. My parents were an inspiration to people around them for so many years. My mother's still alive, and she is still an inspiration. I would encourage all of you to find the gem of meaning in your own life that you can share with other people to inspire and encourage them. Finally, this photograph from a 2013 model rocket launch in Kensington is a reminder that what we share with others lives on in the lives and memories of those we inspire. But also, to me, it is a reminder that we need to stand up and speak out on issues that matter. So my hope is that we will launch a tomorrow with our efforts today. We will launch a tomorrow that's free of war and genocide, and that's blessed with liberty and justice for all. So all people can fulfill their dreams and their life's purpose. And I thank you.